Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning on this glorious, glorious day in Cowes. Welcome to the Saturday chunk of the 10th anniversary Red Funnel Isle of Wight Literary Festival. Really good to see you. A little bit of housekeeping first. Mobile phones, please, on silent, switched off, whatever you prefer to do to make them painless. And in the unlikely event of a fire, the instruction is that everybody, apart from the first person to leave, should follow the first person to leave, okay? Seriously, can't go wrong. My name's Chris. It's my pleasure to steer you through what will be hopefully a very enjoyable hour. This morning we're absolutely delighted to be welcoming a former politician who is also a master wordsmith. In fact, it was probably him who pointed out that the actual word politics is made up of two parts: poly, meaning many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasites. But this man defies all the negative stereotypes you could ever imagine. He carried on smiling while tackling some of the toughest jobs in UK government. He won countless hearts with his 4 volumes of memoirs. He added to the gaiety of the nation with a show-stopping TV appearance as the Masked Singer. And now he's a successful novelist as well. He hasn't mastered brain surgery yet, but the weekend is still young. Ladies and gentlemen, a welcome please for the Right Honourable Alan Johnson. And the strains of Joni Mitchell playing in the background will explain why in a wee while. We have this book to talk about. It's Alan's second novel. One of our ministers is missing. But before, let's just set the scene a bit. I introduced you as the Right Honourable Alan Johnson. Now, yes. You aren't a frontline politician anymore, but you never stop being Right Honourable. Is that right?
No, because you're Right Honourable when you become a Privy Councillor, and you're a Privy Councillor for life.
And in the process of becoming a Privy Councillor, I just want to ask you, because we've just been through this extraordinary moment in the life of our nation, do you kiss hands with as was the Queen?
It's great to be on the Isle of Wight.
Sorry, yes. Diving straight in there. Diving straight in.
And Chris, as a typical BBC Rottweiler, is straight in with the questions. When you are made a Privy Councillor, there's a ceremony that you go through where it's an ancient ceremony from the 14th century where you kneel down and take a pledge, and then you go to another stall and you kneel on the other knee and take another pledge, and then you go before Her Majesty, and as it says in the guidance, you brush her hands lightly with your lips. Okay, that's the kiss. The problem with me, I was made a Privy Councillor in 2003, before I was actually in the cabinet. I was a Minister of State, and I had a small 3-year-old who'd been born in the millennium in 2000, and I was used to giving, it's like with small kids, you give them a big kiss. And when I got to Her Majesty's hand, it was very quiet in there, and there were 9 of my colleagues lined up, other Privy Councillors, and I went and blushed terribly. Her Majesty, as usual, was, pretended she hadn't noticed. But yeah, that was my first experience. Queen probably thought, what have we got here? Goodness gracious.
But of course, as Secretary of State, you would have been in and out swapping seals of office about a million times. And I think, I haven't warned you about this, but somebody told me a story that you told him last night about a lunch you had in Windsor.
Oh yes, Windsor Castle. Well, this is Robert Hardman. It's in Robert Hardman's biography of the Queen. So every bank holiday, Whitsun bank holiday, the Queen hosts a lunch at Windsor Castle. And it's really for the heads of the armed forces and the military. But there's always 2 Privy Councillors who go along to the lunch. And I was asked to go, me and a guy called Paul Murphy, who was the Welsh Secretary at the time. And we got there, and Paul and I were very nervous because we saw that he was sitting on Her Majesty's right and I was sitting on Her Majesty's left. Down the other end was Prince Philip holding court with all the military people. We were up with Her Majesty, and we were saying, oh, we better not talk about this, or we better not mention that. And there was a big story in the papers, as usual, about Diana, long after she died, but there was always a Diana story. And we said, oh, we'd better not mention that. Well, when we sat down, the Queen was very keen to talk about all of that. Because she was with Privy Councillors, we had a cracking time, me and Paul. But here's the story. The meal was splendid, and next to Her Majesty were the corgis. They sat next to her at the head of the table. And when it got to the cheese and biscuits, I said to Paul afterwards, as we were waiting for our government cars, he said, did you enjoy? I said, oh, it's a terrific time. What a wonderful lunch. And he said, did you enjoy the food? I said, yeah, I loved it, particularly cheese and biscuits. He said, I don't think there were any biscuits. I was waiting for the biscuits to come round. I said, well, there were some biscuits in that little silver holder on next to Her Majesty. He said, Alan, they were for the corgis. She would toss them to the corgis. Can I recommend cheddar with bonio? It's really, honestly, it's really nice. It's a bit bitter, but...
Now, your book, its title is One of Our Ministers is Missing, which is a bit of a giveaway. It's about a government minister who disappears in Crete.
Yeah.
Now, you were a minister for 11 years, and actually, I'm going to get you to... Do you mind just going to that tab there and just... There's a little snippet which gives an insight into
the red box, yeah.
into the day-to-day life of a government minister.
Incidentally, I wrote... this is set in 2017. If I'd set it this year, it'd be all of our ministers are missing.
We might come back to that.
I'd have a little competition. Yeah. Which minister do you want to be missing? So I won't explain the subtext of this, but the government car had left his house in Putney that morning with only one ministerial red box on board. As one of Bellingham's civil servants had mentioned when he'd first entered government, the car was provided precisely for that purpose. The nightly red box contained all the important documents that needed ministerial approval, together with the correspondence, which he'd had no role in formulating, requiring his signature. It wasn't that the civil service did all the minister's work for him. This instructive civil servant had been at pains to explain. More a case of them chewing it up so that the minister could swallow it more easily. The red box was lead-lined, so that if the car should be consumed in a ball of flames, the minister may perish, but the precious documents would survive. The red box was indispensable. The minister was not. And that's actually true about the red box.
Is it?
Yes,
Is it?
that the government car service were there to transport the civil service documents around, and if the minister was lucky, he or she would get a lift with them. And it is, the red boxes are lead lined. The other thing about that, just while we're on it, is those government car service drivers. I know you worked for the BBC for a while, and will still do, Chris. I always wondered why the lobby correspondents were employed by newspapers to find out what was happening. They just had to go to the guys in the government car service who drove the ministerial cars. They knew everything. They knew everything. And on one occasion, my first driver when I was a junior minister was a guy called George, who was a real character. He smoked roll-ups, old Holborn roll-ups, sometimes while he was driving. Wouldn't be allowed now. And during the 2001 election, I was a junior minister, fought the election, got another huge majority, coming back into government, and I was listening to hear and watching the telly at home to see who was going to be in the cabinet. Because they obviously appoint the cabinet first, and then it's the other ministerial positions. I was a very lowly minister. And George came every night with my red box. Government still had to function, the red box came every night. And George one time stood on the doorstep on a Friday morning, delivered the red box, lit up his old Holborn, said, Robin Cook's going to be demoted. Robin Cook was the Foreign Secretary. And I said, George, I've been listening to the radio, I've been watching the telly, there's nothing about Robin Cook being demoted. Well, he said his driver, Alf, took him to 10 Downing Street at 1 o'clock. And it's now 5 o'clock, and he's still there. He ain't happy. 10 o'clock news, Robin Cook demoted from Foreign Secretary to the Leader of the House. They should just have gone and asked George. They'd have got their front page scoop.
Fantastic. And so you did this job, I mean, Minister for 11 years, Secretary of State for 6, 7, was it in total, I think? all the cliches about, yes minister and civil servants running rings around the politicians, reasonable?
No, I think Yes Minister, like all good satire, has got an element of truth at the core of it. But, and if the government minister takes their role but doesn't do anything, and there have been government ministers who are just frightened to make a decision and won't sign off those documents that come through to them from the civil service. Should we go ahead with a particular policy? Here's the arguments for, here's the arguments against, we'd need legislation. And they just, I can't make a decision yet. And even to the extent of stashing documents away in their locker for months before they made a decision, that can happen. But if that happens, it's like one of those dual control cars when you're learning to drive. If the minister doesn't put it in gear and drive off, okay, the civil service will do it for them because the country has to operate. But from my experience, the civil service like nothing better than a minister who knows what they want to do, whether that's the Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, or an Under-Secretary at the DTI, as I was in my first ministerial position. That's what they relate to. And so I think Yes Minister is a wonderful, wonderful series, and I see bits in there, like, for instance, there was this scene where Hacker got his first cabinet position, and he's talking to the permanent secretary, to the cabinet secretary, and he explains, he said, well, how does my office run? He said, well, you have a permanent secretary, you have assistant permanent secretaries, you have the principal private secretary, you have a parliamentary private secretary. And there's a scene where Hacker says, well, with all these secretaries, who does my typing? And actually no one does. No one does. So those bits of satire are really great. But if you want something that is absolutely true to life, watch the thick of it. The thick of it is proper, that reflects all the mistakes in government and allows me to tell you my thick of it story because it happened to me after the 2004 general election, 2005. I'd been Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And on the Saturday, I got a phone call from the Prime Minister who said, I want you to be Secretary of State at the DTI, where I'd been as a junior minister, the Department for Trade and Industry. And Tony Blair said, oh, look, I want you to deal with this, nuclear, new build, all this kind of stuff. And right at the end, he said, oh, Alan, we're changing the name of the department. And I said, that's a shame. It's, there's been a Board of Trade and Industry since the 15th century. Why are we changing it? What are we changing it to? He said, for the life of me, I can't remember, but your principal private secretary will ring you tomorrow and let you know. Well, the next day, Matthew, my principal private secretary, rang me. I was on a landline next to the front door where the phone was, and there was a notepad and a pencil. And we had a chat, and at the end of it, I said, Matthew, Prime Minister told me we're changing the name of the department. It's not going to be DTI anymore. What's it going to be? And Matthew said, it'll be the Department of Productivity, I put P, Energy, which in government is a big E and a small N, Industry, and Science. I'd written all this down, and I said, Matthew, that makes me Secretary of State for penis. And I swear, he said, yes, Minister, which is, so this is absolutely true. And the follow-up to that, I mean, that department has changed now to Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, and something else. But I didn't want it to change, and I didn't want it to change to penis. So on the Department for Penis, on the Wednesday, I had to go to number 10 Downing Street to have a chat. All the Secretaries of State had to go and have a chat with the Prime Minister one by one, and all his officials, and talk about the year ahead. And I remember as I left DTI, which is at 1 Victoria Street, to walk to 10 Downing Street, I noticed they'd taken down the sign, Department for Trade and Industry. But they hadn't put a new one up yet. So when I got there, Tony was sitting in a rose garden with all his special advisors and civil servants. It was a lovely day, lovely sunny day, all sat around on wicker chairs. And Tony said to me, we talked about this, that, and the other. And he said, anything else, Alan? I said, yes. why have you changed the name of my department to the Department for Penis? And Tony said, he looked around and everyone looked at the next person. No one was claiming responsibility. So the Prime Minister, bless him, said, well, is it too late to change it back? I said, well, they've taken down the old sign. I don't know why I said this, but I said it this way. But they haven't erected a new... haven't erected a new one. Anyway, bless him, Tony said, just change it back to Department for Trade and Industry. He said, I only made that silly decision, but let's just change it back. And it got me a front page of the Financial Times. Because the CBI didn't like the change yeah, that could be an episode from the thick of it, couldn't it?
Yeah.
And, people would think it was total fiction.
All too real. Yeah. So your minister, the minister here, character called Edward Bellingham. Now, he's a junior Conservative minister, member of the House of Lords. Quite a type as a politician, isn't he? I mean, first of all, let's get one cliche out of the way. He's a dumpy bloke with a beautiful wife, isn't he?
Yes. Yes.
What is it about power and...
Yeah, was it about power and all that? Well, he is also head of Bellingham Developments. Was very rich, contributed a lot of money to the Conservative Party, was a councillor in Wandsworth, not unusual. That's where Theresa May was a councillor as well. This is not based on anyone, by the way, and then got a seat in the Lords. And he had to be in the Lords because can't give too much of this away, but if a minister goes missing on a holiday and they're an elected minister with a constituency and all the rest of it, it's kind of more serious than if it's a member of the House of Lords. I'm not saying that they're dispensable and we should send them off to the White Mountains of Crete, but it made it more believable what happened subsequently, that he was a peer rather than an elected MP.
You've said something that I wasn't quite sure I was going to ask you, but I'm going to ask you now. You said it's not based on anybody real, but this character is the Minister for the Overseas Territories, and there is a Lord Bellingham, a real one, who was the Minister for the Overseas Territories, Lord Henry Bellingham.
Yeah.
What's going on there, Alan?
Yeah, well, Henry hasn't sued me yet, and I know him very well. It wasn't based on him. Bellingham was just a name that came to me, and then afterwards perhaps this is subconscious. I mean, actually, there's only been one Prime Minister in the history of this country who was ever assassinated, and that was Spencer Perceval in, I think, 1806. He was walking out of what is still there, behind Westminster Hall, the ancient part of the Palace of Westminster, and someone he owed money to was there, got a gun out, and killed him. The guy who killed him was called Bellingham, and Henry Bellingham is a direct descendant of the man who assassinated our Prime Minister, which I always found fascinating. So perhaps that's bubbled up. But it's not based on Henry at all.
No,
I
think we give.
I don't like this guy, but I like Henry.
We give little away when we say that your minister in the book is not the nicest character in the world. No. And by the way, there's a moment, there's a scene where our character, the minister in question, goes to see an elderly gentleman who is standing in the way of one of his projects. And I'm going to just quote a lovely line. You say of this visit, his attitude was magisterial as he prepared to address this loyal supporter of the Conservative and Unionist Party, a breed of person that Bellingham regarded as being the salt of the earth, people who knew their place. Yeah. That's delightfully arch, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you've had some fun with some of those political digs in this book.
Well, this is Stanley Brewer, who's in his 90s, refuses to move out of his place in the Docklands, the last of the Docklands development, which Bellingham Developments wish to complete, and they want to make a hotel casino complex, and this 92-year-old man is standing in their way. Edward Bellingham is told, look, if you go as a peer, and a Conservative peer, he's always been a Conservative supporter. He's one of these working class Tories. I grew up with loads of them. My brother-in-law was one, nothing against them whatsoever. Except when Bellingham gets there, this is set in 2017, as I say, he's no longer a supporter of the Conservative Party. When Edward Bellingham starts all his charm offensive, the question from Stanley Brewer is, how did you vote? And he says, oh, well, as a peer, I'm not allowed to vote in general election, but I would have voted Conservatives. He said, no. How did you vote? Remain or leave? And then he very soon finds out that this guy is no longer a supporter supporter of the Conservative Party. I support Nigel, he says. I support Nigel. So he was under a complete misapprehension.
And again, that's you having a bit of fun at the travails of the Conservative Party in the last few years, I suppose.
Yeah, only a little bit of fun, but this is not a political book, it's a thriller. So.
Yeah. Well, and let's just tiptoe into that. I mean, I almost don't dare mention the B word because we're so over it now, aren't we? But of course, you were.
It's all going swimmingly now, yeah.
But see, you were the man whose task was to persuade Jeremy Corbyn to be enthusiastic about Remain, effectively, weren't you? How did that go?
Yeah. Well, he was never enthusiastic. He was always a leaver, was Jeremy. But he realised, Labour Party conference had been 100% behind remaining in the European Union, and he couldn't stand out against that. So, I mean, I always make the point, we got 66% of Labour supporters, not members, supporters, voting to remain. It would have been 76%, I think, if Jeremy had got his finger out, but nevertheless, that was a decent outcome. David Cameron, who actually called this referendum and was the leader of the Conservative Party and was, in a sense, leading the campaign to remain, could only get 30% of Conservative Party supporters. So that was it wasn't, this was, if you think of it the way I think of it, it was Cameron's folly, not Corbyn's. Yeah. I blame Jeremy Corbyn for a lot of things, but I don't blame him for that.
Yeah. And actually, I've seen you interviewed saying that Cameron will go down as the equivalent of Lord North, who lost America for us. Yeah. You still feel that viscerally.
I do, because there was absolutely no reason to have a referendum. We don't govern by referendum. We're a parliamentary democracy. Having these, yes, no, or remain, leave questions is not the way to run a country. And so, yes, we'd had the one in the 70s. On the list back then, this is around 2015 when 2014, 2015 when he announced there'd be a referendum, a list of voters' concerns didn't include membership of the European Union. There was no great call for it, leaving Farage to one side. Yes, there were concerns about immigration, but that's a different issue, actually. You could have dealt with lots of those issues without leaving the European Union. But, so to make a decision, which was basically because he felt that Farage and UKIP were pulling away too many Conservative supporters, and it was for his own party gain that he had that referendum, rather than anything to do with the national good. That's why I think it was a complete folly.
And we've lived through so much history recently, haven't we, where you can look back and say, on odd things, the life of the nation turned. I think of Ed Miliband's bacon sandwich. Did that change the life of the nation? It may have done.
That's a very good point, yeah. Well, if Ed hadn't stood against his brother, David, I was a big supporter of David Miliband in 2010, who knows, Yeah. But those things are...
Let's having done, we might come back to a bit of politics because you know stuff about that, but you also know an awful lot of stuff about, well, one in particular of the locations for this book. Just very briefly, there are two key locations outside London, and in reverse order, the one I'd go to first is the Lake District. And you were telling me earlier that your wife sort of grew up there and knows it very well.
Carolyn's from Carlisle, so, I've been up that way a lot, and I got to know the Lake District a bit. It's the perfect place for, this plot, without giving the plot away, to kind of, in a sense, culminate in the Lake District. Yeah. But the main venue is Crete. Place is very important in novels, I think. I've read fiction, since I was a kid. Since my mum, amazingly, had no history of books in her life. She was one of 11 children born in Liverpool. Her mother had had 11 children by the age of 38. And died when she was 42. Her mother, my mother's maternal grandmother, had died when she was 42. My mother was always convinced that there was some curse of the female line that meant that she would die at 42, and she did. She had a heart condition called mitral stenosis. But she never grew up with books. There were no books around in her house. She left home in Liverpool as soon as she could, when she was 18, to come down to London to work in the NAFI, because war had broken out. And then my sister was born in 1947, I was born in 1950, and she was dragging us to Ladbroke Grove Library. We were reluctant, she was dragging us there. She had this faith in books as a form of good, of getting words into children's heads. And there'll be teachers and social workers in this audience probably who, I mean, you can buy whole volumes on that now, that how crucial that is. But this was 1950. For my mother instinctively to feel that books were important and to instill this love of books and love of fiction in me was incredible. Now, what was your question, Chris?
Well, no, actually, and by the way, just in parenthesis, one of the missions of this festival, of course, is outside these forums. The part of the work it does is in schools on the island, which is a fantastic thing. It was about place.
Yes.
But let's do books briefly, because you took us there. And I believe there's a particular teacher who helped inspire you in your reading and your writing, who you tracked down, didn't you?
Yeah, Mr. Carr. So when I was 14, at a grammar school, Sloane Grammar School in Chelsea, where I wasn't very happy at all. I wasn't hardly ever there. By then, and my sister was bringing me up. She was only 15, I was 13. That's another story. But into my life came this great teacher. Everyone's got one great teacher at least, and if they're fortunate, maybe two or three. And Mr. Carlin was our English teacher when we were what we then called the fourth form. I don't know what they call it now, year something or other. And he had this mellifluous voice that commanded respect. I mean, every teacher then was licensed to beat you. The cane was in the corner. Mr. Carlin didn't need the cane. He had a natural authority. And he chalked on the blackboard, as you did then, Wilfred Owen's Anthem for Doomed Youth, and taught us the meaning of alliteration, the rifle's rapid rattle. First time I'd seen poetry. He got all us boys, it was boys' school, reading Animal Farm by George Orwell, which is a fabulous story about the animals taking over the farm and expelling Mr. Jones from Manor Farm. But he explained the subtext, which was the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, Orwell, a democratic socialist, was warning against the extremes on the left, communism, as well as the extremes on the right, fascism. He was warning against totalitarianism in that book and subsequently in 1984. And Mr. Carlin explained that to us. And I can see there's some fellow baby boomers here. This was 1964, so a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were going out into a world divided between capitalism and communism. A third of the world lived under communism. I could have very much in my political life sort of been steered to the left, given where I came from. Mr. Carlin had introduced me to George Orwell, who in turn had made me a democratic socialist and very suspicious of these kind of, these forms of government that depended on a secret police to make them work. And Mr. Carlin took some of us kids to the theatre for the first time in our lives. He took us to, at his own expense, Oblimov with Spike Milligan, Half a Sixpence with Tommy Steele, big musical in the West End in '64. He saw that I was a voracious reader of whatever rubbish sort of came along and said, have you ever read Dickens? Have you ever read Arnold Bennett? Have you ever read C.S. Forrester? Have you ever read Geoffrey Household? He got me, Arnold Bennett was a big, Mr. Carlin was a big fan of Arnold Bennett. He got me Wilkie Collins, he got me reading these books. And then, although I left when I was 15, his education carried on because he gave us all 50 books you have to read in your lives. And I took Mr. Carlin so seriously, I read all 50 books. So I got them from the library, from Ladbroke Grove Library. And, it was a wonderful education. And they were books now, while we're at a literary festival, authors, John Wyndham, you don't hear about John Wyndham now, but, the Midwich Cuckoos and the Crake and Wakes. And there was William Golding's Lord of the Flies, which was a huge book in 1964. There were writers that have almost disappeared, because someone asked me at a book festival for that list of 50 books, which disappeared long ago. But I sat down and thought about it, because this woman had emailed me after coming to the Henley Festival. And I remembered, I reckon I got up to about 40 of the books, and I'm pretty sure that Neville Shute, you don't hear Neville Shute so much now. No Highway by Neville Shute was on Mr. Carlin's list, as well as Trollope and Wilkie Collins and Dickens and all of that. Anyway, I tracked Mr. Carlin down, and the great thing is he's still around to mark my homework, because he told me I submitted a detective story based on the stuff I was reading at that time, sort of Earl Stanley Gardner, Marjorie Aldringham, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers. I had a character called Inspector Andrews and another character called Mr. Midnight, loosely based on The Saint by Leslie Charteris. Mr. Carlin said, Alan, why don't you submit this for publication? What? And he got this old, battered, dog-eared version of the Artists and Writers Yearbook, which is still published now, even in this internet age. It has the address of every publication, no matter how obscure. And I'd send off my poetry and stories, inevitably get a rejection slip. Mr. Carlin, I've got this rejection slip. Alan, he said, every great writer could paper their walls with rejection slips. Don't give up. And 56 years later came my first thriller, The Late Train to Gypsy Hill, which I dedicated to Mr. Carlin. And he's still alive to mark my homework. He lives down in Bath. He's 92. His son we invited him to the book launch, which was actually at the Savoy Hotel. That's another story. It was on the telly in the last series of the Savoy, which was a happy accident. But we invited Mr. Carlin to come. He was too frail, but his son did a video message from him. And so I switched it on, and he had a glass of bubbly in his back garden. Alan, he said, and I sat up straight as soon as I heard Mr. Carlin's mellifluous voice. Anyway, he did all that. He doesn't remember a single thing about me. Because why would you? I mean, you know, he's had thousands of kids go. He became a very distinguished head teacher after he left Sloane. You remember them, because there's only one person for you to remember. They kind of would struggle to remember you. And I know that Mr. Carlin was struggling, because he gave me a politician's answer. When I said, you do remember him? Yes, of course I remember. I still live in the area I used to represent in East Yorkshire. When I go round Sainsbury's in Hessel, often there's someone who will come up to me and say, oh, Mr. Johnson, remember, I came to your surgery in 2001 about my drains. I'm not going to say, no, of course I don't remember you. Let me get on with my shopping. Of course, that would be hurtful. So yes, I remember you. And Mr. Carlin was yes, I remember you, but I could see in his eyes it was a politician's answer.
Oh, so let's get back to Crete.
Yeah.
How and when did you fall in love with Crete?
Oh, me and Carolyn, who's here somewhere, went there first time, I think, in about 2014, and fell in love with it immediately. I wrote a piece for the Mail on Sunday. I don't often write for the Mail on Sunday, but they asked me to do a travel piece on the back of this book about Crete. And I explained there, we were down Elafonisi Beach near there, and I mean, the whole island is just so amazing. It's long and it's thin, and it's good for this book because you can cross it at certain points in one day. And my minister, Lord Bellingham, going back to him, wanted to walk across it in a matter of hours. He didn't want to spend time in a tent or anything, so that was perfect for that. But there's a charm about Crete, and in particular, as we drove through the White Mountains a few years later, Carolyn said to me, this would be a good place for someone to disappear. And indeed, there are stories about people disappearing in the White Mountains and not being found, or their skeleton found 10 years later. I mean, they're actual stories, you can look it up. And so that's why I dedicate this book to Carolyn, because it was her idea, made it the perfect location. But I think it's a wonderful place, particularly the south coast, because the north coast of Crete faces Europe, south coast faces Libya, faces Africa, the Libyan Sea down on the south coast. And although the north coast has got the airports and the resorts, the south coast is well worth a visit, which once again made it, great for the drug smuggling and the people smuggling that goes on in one of our ministers is missing.
Well, and here you've taken us back a little bit to one of your political roles, because as a former Home Secretary, first of all, this is the second novel in which we see your detective. This is Louise Mangan, who by this stage is an assistant commissioner at the Met, and she's a thoroughly decent human being, isn't she? Is that your experience generally of these people?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a great supporter of the British police. I mean, yes, you've got these terrible events that have come about and come intermittently. They come in every police force in the world, but because the police are in authority, you won't find a police service anywhere in the world that is less corruptible and less full of those problems than the British police. And that's because of Robert Peel's genius when he created the Metropolitan Police back in whenever, 1830 something. You know, he would not use military titles. There are no colonels, there are no generals, there are no captains in our police. He deliberately wanted to ensure that they weren't mixed up with the military. And his philosophy was that the police are citizens in uniform. And that's what we have to keep dragging the police back to. I mean, some of the problems at the moment, by the way, I have to say, and it's worth mentioning, when Theresa May succeeded me as Home Secretary, she offered up to George Osborne 1/5 of the police numbers. They cut the police numbers by 20%. Now they're scrambling as if it's a different government, because when Boris Johnson came in, he quite rightly, crime was going up. It's now a 14-year high. And so they're scrambling to get the police back, recruiting back. But they've lost all that institutional memory and all that experience. And the people they're recruiting now, and they're still not up to the 20,000 they cut, are very inexperienced. So I think we're fortunate in our police. In my time as Home Secretary, I had nothing but admiration for these men and women who go to work every day not knowing what danger they're going to face, who put themselves in harm's way. And similarly with the security services. So basically, I'd written so many memoirs, I was sick of writing about myself. I would say at events like this, I want to get onto fiction, to which some wag would always say, why don't you write your next party manifesto if you want to write fiction? That is a cynical view of politics. So eventually, I managed to get onto this. And there's a couple of things about this book I just want to mention. Well, one thing in particular. I want you to buy the book, because I think books are great at keeping bookshops going. But if you do want to get the audio book, the actor who does the audio book for this is a guy called Richard Attlee. Number one, he is Clem Attlee's grandson. I'm a Labour politician. Clem Attlee is, probably the greatest leader and one of the greatest politicians, prime ministers this country's ever had. This is Clem Attlee's grandson. Number two, he plays Kenton in The Archers. And I've been listening to The Archers all my life. So, to me, the hero of this book is not the man who wrote it, it's the man who recites it and acts it really well on the audio book.
Fantastic. The other thing, and it's a serious theme, because you've mentioned it very fleetingly, there's a theme about people smuggling. Some of the bad guys in this book are people smugglers. And again, as a Home Secretary, I'm sure you feel enormous sympathy for Suella Braverman and her position at the moment and her dreams. But actually,
I'll try and generate some.
Genuinely, this is not an easy problem to deal with, is it?
No, and that is a serious point, actually. I do. Suella Braverman's got a tough job. Priti Patel had a tough job before her. But you could see this coming, by the way. I can't understand why there is not an international effort to resolve this. If you remember back to the time when no ship could go round the Horn of Africa or down past the African coast without pirates coming out, on little kind of boats with machine guns, and were taking over ships. It was a big, big problem. You don't hear about it anymore. Why don't you hear about it now? Because there was a concerted effort between the European Union, the United Nations, the international police community to stop it. And I don't know why that hasn't happened with what's happening across the Channel. If the National Crime Agency worked with the international police community to tackle this, it would be tackled. Because you can't, yes, there's a lot of places you can launch from in France, but not that many that you can't, with modern technology, see where the people are going and track them down and get the perpetrators, which are the criminals who are organising this people trafficking. So I can't understand why that hasn't happened, number one. Number two, of course, and I'm sorry to go back to this, but I was pointing out at the time, look, if you think that immigration is the problem, and most people voted on that Europe referendum, the biggest reason for the Leave vote was about immigration. And I kind of understand that, because you had unlimited immigration with freedom of movement from the European Union. In fact, it got to 333,000 net migration figure, the highest ever, much higher than when we brought Poland and the Czech Republic and all those Eastern European countries in, much and that was a month before election day. But I was pointing out that actually, while we're in the European Union, we have access to something called the Dublin Accord, which meant that asylum seekers had to register in the first country they came to. They couldn't go through all the different countries and all the rest. We've lost that now. We can't go, there's no ability to return to the original country. And God, the moral aspects of sending them to Rwanda is another, would be here for another hour. But they can't actually do that. The French, now that we've left the European Union, are not so keen to work with us. And when you hear people like Liz Truss saying she doesn't know whether Macron is good or bad for the country, I mean, that was a stupid thing to say. She's since changed her mind on that. None of this kind of rolls the wicket for the kind of international cooperation that you need. And so I think, so if people thought they were going to take back control by leaving the European Union, you just have to see on that issue and many others, it's the opposite.
Well, you clearly still feel very passionately about many of these things. I've just got to ask you the obvious question that people have asked you a million times. There were 2 occasions when you might have been leader of your party. Why aren't you?
Oh, basically because I'm great at talking about all these things, but not as good at doing them. I never wanted to be the leader. You have to want to be the leader. I mean, thank goodness there are people like Liz Truss or David Cameron or Boris Johnson. Or maybe not. No, delete the last one. Thank God there are people who want to do that god-awful job. I saw it firsthand, with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. I saw what it did to your life. I saw the kind of qualities it takes to do that. And I just haven't got those qualities, as simple as that. So I'd rather have people saying, he'd have been a good Prime Minister, than saying, God, that disaster, Alan Johnson, Jesus, wasn't he awful? And what it does to your family, Chris, is also, for the rest of your life, there's people delving into your background. And also, you have to have 24-hour protection for the rest of your life. I had it for, by the time it finished, about 18 months, and I hated it.
Alan, thank you so much. Housekeeping announcement at the end of our session, which is only 15, 20 minutes away now. I'm going to ask everyone to wait until Alan's got to the exit, because he needs to be at the signing table first, very important, out towards the rotunda. But this is the point where I'd love to invite questions from anybody who has any, and it could be about the inspiration of a thriller set in Crete about a minister who goes missing, or it could be about very many different aspects of Alan's extraordinary life and career. Who would like to go first?
We could sing to you. We could get a guitar. We could do a Joni Mitchell number.
Oh, I'll ask you about Joni before we go. But anybody want to kick off with the first question? Man, there.
Oh, yes, I'm still friends with Michael Portillo. Yeah, great friends with Michael Portillo, who last time I was here in 2016, he was coming over. And I remember saying, I just cannot get rid of him. He just will never. Everywhere, I went on a theatre tour, the 50 dates around a theatre tour, on the back of my music memoir, In My Life. And we had these great sessions where we played records and talked about the book and talked about pop music. And every theatre I went to, practically, backstage, they have photographs of people who've been there before. Portillo, always, in those awful lilac jackets and a horrible yellow. Yeah, I'm great friends with Michael. I'll be seeing him soon. When he gets off a train.
Any more hands? And we do have a roving mic if you haven't got a very loud voice. Oh, no, we haven't got it, no. We haven't got to have a very loud voice. Was that a gentleman right at the back with a hand? No? Okay. Oh. Right, I'll go for you there, sir, in the grey. The best speech that Alan heard in Parliament?
The best speech I ever heard was one that I didn't agree with, by a great friend of mine, the previously mentioned Robin Cook. Robin Cook was a bit of a mentor of mine, mainly because we both were part of the campaign for electoral reform. We're great believers in proportional representation, and so we worked together on that a lot. Of course, Robin resigned from the cabinet over the Iraq war, and in that debate we had in Parliament, I mean, the first time this country's ever been to war by decision of Parliament rather than the raw prerogative. And that debate was very stormy. Robin resigned and then made a speech from the back benches as to why he had resigned, and it was so powerful. He was a great speechwriter. I've been with Robin on many occasions. He'd just write a couple of notes on the top of a bit of notepaper, and out of it would emerge an eloquent, 25-minute speech. He was an amazing, amazing person, much missed, died much too young. So whilst I didn't agree, and still don't agree, with the argument he was making, it was a really, and sometimes the speeches you admire most are the speeches where someone's not saying what you agree with, they're saying what you don't agree with. That's the whole point of a parliament. That's where jaw is better than war, except on that occasion.
And actually, I can recall the visual impact as he finished. I think he was crying, wasn't he? He sort of emotionally crumpled at the end. Extraordinary, electric
yes,
moment.
there were tears in his eyes. You never saw tears in Robin's eyes very much. He wasn't a very emotional man, and he was he was a loner, very much a loner. So, yeah, it was powerful stuff.
We had a question down, madam. The question is, what made Alan decide to turn to novels rather than sticking with the non-fiction stuff?
I always wanted to write fiction. As I say, I would mention it at a few conferences like book events like this, and get a cynical response. But I was sick of writing about myself. There's only so much memoir you can do. The music memoir was a bit different from the 3 volumes that were my life. My publisher was saying, well, you've finished The Long and Winding Road, which is the 3rd bit of the autobiography, if you like. Just as you go into the Home Office, there's plenty of line there, there's plenty of material there. I wanted to get into fiction. And as a reader, although my books won lots of prizes, and I'm very proud of that, I don't really think you can call yourself a writer until you've developed character and plot, until you've created this world that readers immerse themselves in voluntarily, even though they know it's total fiction, immerse themselves in it for all the time it takes to read 80,000 words, which is a lot of words to write and a lot of words to read. And so I was always, that was Matterhorn, that was my big challenge. And when I left Parliament, that's what I left Parliament to do, because I knew really I'd need 100% concentration, more so than with memoirs, to write the fiction. And it is hard, but it's so satisfying when it's done. This is the 2nd, now I've got a 3rd coming, so the deal was with the publisher, they wanted 3 Mangan books, so Louise Mangan, who's my detective, and the 3rd one I'm writing now, and it's an absolute pleasure. And it's a pleasure because I find writing really good because you're in control. You don't need civil servants, you don't need special advisors. In politics, you're never in control. No one knows what's going to happen. No one knew that COVID was going to come around the corner. No one knew Putin was going to invade Ukraine. In writing, you are totally in control of all those characters and their lives, and you can rewrite and write over again, which you do. So, and then when it's finished, you get a lovely book like that, and then you come out to places like this. So we've just come from, where did we start? Forget where we started. We started the week in Sevenoaks, and then we went to Cardiff. Then we went from Cardiff to Henley. Then we came from Henley to here, and now I'm on it at Cheltenham tonight, and then on Cheltenham tomorrow, and I'm doing something on Cheltenham tomorrow afternoon as well. It's the closest I get to being a rock star. I haven't given up on being a rock star, but it's the closest I get. I'll get a t-shirt printed with the tour dates on the back. Yeah,
fantastic. I think we've got time for just 1 or 2 more. In the red, I don't know. Thoughts on the Miliband brothers and the David we never had, as it were?
Yes. Well, I think I launched David Miliband's campaign before he wanted me to, because when the electorate dispensed with our services, I remember, and then there was that 3 days when the coalition was eventually formed. We thought for a while that the Lib Dems might come in coalition with us, but in the end they went in with the Tories. And I went on the Today programme, and they asked me, I think Humphreys it was, are you going to stand? And I said, no, but I'm going to be supporting David Miliband's campaign. David hadn't even announced that he was standing yet. And so I was very much on David's side. My view was that you've got these two incredibly talented brothers, although I was never in any doubt who was the most talented. And David had the experience. He was Foreign Secretary when I was Home Secretary. And just, you know, he was outstanding. It's almost Shakespearean. His brother stands against him and lost him the job. Although David won it on votes of MPs, he won on votes of members, he won. Trade union side, the third part of it, he lost, and that's how Ed Miliband got in. But the thing about Ed is he's 6 years younger than David, and if David had won, Ed would have sort of come along and would have had a cabinet position. And now, actually, you can see Ed Miliband's a very good shadow environment secretary. It could have been good for both of them. As it's happened, David's the kind of lost leader over the water because he'll never be back. He might come back to live here, but he'll never come back into politics, which is a great shame because I think he was a hugely talented individual.
And Ed's quite a good radio DJ, isn't he?
He's very good, yes, yeah, which I never was. Well, you were.
Yeah. Back in the day. Any more for any more? Sir at the front. Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yes, I wasn't going to let Joni Mitchell go. Hey, I'll tell you what. We'll do that at the very end. So there's a gentleman there at the back as well who had his hand up. Any research on the history of Crete?
Well, of course, my publisher had to send me to Crete for a while, and that was a shame, but we got through that. I did quite a bit of research because there's also Lake Kornos, which I think you pronounce it Kornos, but it's in the book, and it's kind of the only real lake on the island, and I've got something happening around there, so I had to research that, research the White Mountains, and get to know the island. I mean, we did actually go, my publisher didn't pay, unfortunately we paid, on an actual holiday to get all the different places. Because as I was saying earlier, but I didn't finish off, it is important to me as a reader, the importance of place. Characters are really important, but if you can evoke the place as well, whether that's, you know, the wet streets of Glasgow in some detective stories, or it's London or whatever, place is important. It's as important as character, I think. So I did more research than I would normally do for this book.
We might, Steve at the back, might be able to just gently play that Joni Mitchell tune in the background while we ask Alan, what's the significance? It's called Corey, isn't it, I think? Carrie. This is a particular tune from the Blue album. That's her.
That's her. Beautiful. And this is from an album called Blue, which is my favourite Joni Mitchell album. Lots of other heads nodding to that. But it happens on Crete. Carrie was an actual character who Joni Mitchell met. And that was on the south coast of Crete when she went with several other hippies to live in those tombs that are cut into the rock face. I'm trying to think of the town now, but someone will tell you afterwards. But it's just up the road from where my book's set, which is Agia Galini. And he, when she talks about his cane, his swirling cane, Carrie, get out your cane, this was a character who was a chef in a restaurant, American. I think he was American, and he did exist, and that was part of my research.
Well,
so the book ends with a Joni Mitchell reference.
There you are. That's the answer. It is a romp. You know, it's vivid. The climax is properly filmic, I would say. I was there. I could see it in front of me.
Any Hollywood directors in the audience want to come and see me?
You never know. Alan will be signing copies of it over by the rotunda. It's called One of Our Ministers is Missing. Can we have a big thank you for Alan Johnson?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.